$500 for a mud hole. That was the line said out loud in front of the whole feed store in Sweet Gum, and half the men leaning against the counter laughed the way men laugh when somebody has done their laughing for them. Elton Rourke said it, thumbs in his belt, telling anybody who'd listen that he'd finally found a fool to take that drowned corner of Talco County off his hands, and that the fool was Verna Grimes' grandbaby, the quiet one, the girl who never had much to say, and now had even less, on account of she was standing right there. And Odessa Grimes, 22 years old, hands rough as fence wire, looked at him across a spread of seed packets and coiled rope, and said the only thing she said all afternoon. "It's not mud," she told him. "It's clay." And Clay remembers. Nobody knew what she meant. That was the point. Out past the town, down a rutted red road that turned to soup every spring, sat the field they were laughing about, 40 acres of low ground that flooded when the sky so much as frowned, ground that wouldn't grow cotton or corn or a decent excuse, ground that had swallowed 3 men's dreams before it swallowed their money. By the shed at the edge of it, come the following autumn, there would be a growing pile of ruined things, cracked and blackened shapes stacked like broken teeth, and the whole town would slow their trucks at her fence to look. They thought they were watching a girl fail. They were watching her learn. Under that worthless field, 40 feet down through the wet clay and the sandy seam, lay a bed of something so rare that grown men in pressed shirts would one day stand in that same field and say the number $40 million out loud, and mean it. Odessa was the only living soul who knew it was down there. Her grandmother had known, and her grandmother was in the ground now, too. Nobody guessed, not yet. And before I tell you how she knew, and how a girl the whole town rode off in a single afternoon ended up sitting on a fortune that the people who laughed would beg to buy, do me one small favor. If you have ever stood somewhere and seen worth in a thing everybody else called trash, if you have ever kept something the world told you to throw away, take 1 second right now and subscribe, and leave me a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because this story is for the ones who look twice, and I want to know how many of you are out there. Stay with me. The pile of broken things gets bigger before it gets holy. This is a story about patience, so it is going to take its time, the same slow way she did. 2 years before Elton Rourke found his fool, there was only an old woman and a girl, and a field that belonged to neither of them. Verna Grimes had worked that low ground for 41 years without ever once owning a foot of it. Worked it for other men on shares, on promises, on the back end of somebody else's harvest, and every one of those years she looked at that flooded corner the way a person looks at a room they were told they'd never live in. She had raised Odessa since the child was 4, since the winter Odessa's mother went north for work, and the letters got thinner and then stopped, and she raised her plain without pity, the way you raise someone you love too much to lie to. In a town full of people going somewhere, the 2 of them stayed. Everybody Odessa had grown up with was leaving Sweet Gum the way water leaves a cracked bucket, off to the city for the good jobs, the paved streets, the lives you could photograph, and they'd tell her, "Come on, Des, there's nothing here," and she'd nod and say maybe so, and go back to whatever was in her hands, because there was always something in her hands. That was the thing about Odessa nobody bothered to notice. She was slow to speak and slower to leave, and grown folks mistook that for dull, but her hands never sat still. She could fix a busted pump with a coat hanger and a prayer. She could take a dead radio apart on the porch and have it singing by supper. She whittled, she wired, she patched, she mended, and she watched her grandmother's hands more than anything else in the world, because her grandmother's hands did the one thing that never made any sense to the rest of Sweet Gum. Verna Grimes made pots, not for selling, for nothing, the town figured. She'd walk out to the low ground after the water pulled back and dig up a bucket of the strange gray clay that lay just under the topsoil, blue-gray and slick and cold as a well. And she'd carry it home and wedge it on a board and turn it, by hand, on a kick wheel her own daddy had built out of a truck flywheel and a fence post. She made bowls and jars and squat little pitchers, and she fired them in a hole in the yard lined with brick. And when the neighbors asked what in the world she was doing, she'd smile and say she was listening. To what, they'd ask, and she'd say, to the dirt. They loved her, and they thought she was foolish, and both those things can be true at once. But there was one more thing Verna Grimes had that nobody knew about, and it was a notebook, a fat coffee-stained composition book with a rubber band around it and 41 years of hard-won knowing crammed inside. And on the first page, in her careful slanted hand, was one sentence she'd written the day she first tasted that gray clay on the tip of her tongue and knew it was different. Nothing's worthless, she'd written. It's just waiting on somebody patient enough to look at it twice. Odessa didn't understand that sentence yet. In 2 years, it was going to save her life. Verna's hands got slower that last winter, and she knew it before Odessa did, the way old people know things. She started making the girl sit with her at the wheel in the evenings, guiding her fingers into the cold spinning clay, telling her when to press and when to let be, and mostly telling her to let be, because the hardest thing to teach a young person, she said, is that you can love a thing by leaving it alone. Give it time, she'd say. Time's the only thing turns mud into gold. And Odessa, who was good at silence, said nothing and learned. She learned the clay had a memory in it, that if you rushed it or forced it, it would remember the insult and split on you 3 days later out of pure spite. She learned that the low ground wasn't drowning at all, it was feeding, that the water that ruined it for cotton was the same water that laid down that fine gray seam grain by grain over 10,000 years. She learned her grandmother's whole strange life had been an argument nobody in town could hear. And then one gray morning in March, Verna Grimes did not wake up. She went in her sleep, easy, the way she'd have picked if you'd let her pick, and Odessa found her looking almost pleased about something, one hand resting open on the quilt as if she'd just set something down. The town came, the way towns do. They brought casseroles and closed caskets and the long, low sound of a country funeral. And they said all the kind things you say. And under the kind things ran the other current. The one that said, now, what will become of that odd, quiet girl with no people left? Verna left almost nothing. A little house that leaned, a kick wheel, a hole in the yard, $512 in a coffee tin behind the flour, money she'd been saving one bill at a time toward a dream she'd never once spoken out loud until the very end, and the notebook. On the last afternoon Verna could still talk, she'd pressed that coffee-stained book into Odessa's hands and closed the girl's fingers around it and said, "This here is everything I know, and everything I know is worth more than that whole town thinks the both of us are worth put together." And then she said the thing that made no sense, the thing about the field. Buy it, Des. Buy my low ground before they know what it is. I'd have done it myself if I'd had the years. And Odessa said, "Grandma, that field floods. That field's no good." And Verna, with the last real strength in her, squeezed the girl's hand and said, "It isn't broken, baby. It's just waiting on somebody patient enough to look at it twice." 2 weeks after the funeral, Odessa walked into that feed store with $512 in a coffee tin and told Elton Rourke she wanted to buy the low ground. And Elton Rourke, who had inherited that flooded corner from his own daddy and considered it a curse in a deed, could not sign the papers fast enough. He was so tickled to be rid of it that he barely mentioned the back taxes. Barely. He mentioned them the way you mention a step you already know is there. Quick and low, sliding a second sheet across the counter. "Little matter of the lien," he said. "County's got a claim on that ground for unpaid taxes, going back some years. You take the field, you take the debt. $1,400, due by the county's books before the first hard frost, or the county takes it back and sells it out from under you, and won't nobody give you your $500 back either." He said it smiling. "It's your money," he said, and shrugged. and that shrug was going to come back and stand on her chest in November. $1,400 by first frost. She had 12 left in the tin after the purchase. She had no job but odd work, no plan the town could see, and a piece of ground everybody agreed was worth less than the paper it was deeded on. She had a dead woman's notebook and a sentence she didn't fully understand. That was what Odessa Grimes owned, standing in the road that evening with the deed folded in her shirt pocket, looking out at 40 acres of water going pink with the sunset. And here's the part the town could not have known, the part that changes everything, the part her grandmother had written down in that book 300 pages deep. The low ground did not just have good potting clay in the top few feet. Verna had dug a well by hand once, decades back, dug it deep, looking for water that didn't taste of iron, and 40 feet down her post hole digger had come up loaded with something else. A clay so pure, so white, so fine it squeaked. A kind Verna had only ever read about in a library book 2 counties over. The kind that potters and the great porcelain houses of the world will pay dearly for and almost never find, laid down in a seam that ran, by Verna's careful pacing and figuring, under near the whole 40 acres. She had never told a soul. She had never had the money to prove it or the years to use it. She had left it, like a coin under a mattress, for the one person she trusted to look at it twice. Odessa read that page by lamplight the first night in the leaning house alone, read it 3 times, and then sat very still while the cold settled in her stomach, not from fear, from knowing. She understood now why her grandmother had died looking pleased. Verna Grimes had spent her whole life being told she owned nothing and could decide nothing, and with her last breath she had reached out and handed her granddaughter the one thing the world had never let her keep, a door. Now, whether Odessa could walk through it before the county slammed it shut, that was a different question, and the town of Sweet Gum was going to answer that question loud and early and wrong. Word travels in a place that's small the way fire travels in dry grass, and by the end of the week everybody knew that Verna's grandbaby had spent her grandmother's burial money on the drowned 40 and taken on a tax debt to boot. The kind ones shook their heads, the rest just laughed, and nobody laughed easier than Coy Tillman. Coy had gone to school with Odessa, a big, easy, grinning boy who'd never once in his life had to look twice at anything because everything had always come to him the first time. He farmed his daddy's good high ground and drove a truck that didn't have a spot of rust on it, and he took to slowing that truck at Odessa's fence line whenever he passed, which was often, leaning on the horn just to watch her look up from whatever she was carrying. "Building an ark out there, Des," he'd holler, not unkindly, and that was the worst part, that it wasn't even cruel. It was just Coy repeating what the whole town had already decided, the way you'd read a weather report. "You gonna grow rice? You gonna raise catfish in your front yard?" And Odessa would set down her bucket of gray clay and look at him a moment and then just go back to her work, and her silence made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name, so he'd laugh again and drive on. She said nothing. It was enough. Because while Coy Tillman drove past laughing, Odessa Grimes was doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was to put her hands into the cold and start. She dug clay the way her grandmother taught her, in the gray morning after the ground firmed, cutting slick blue-gray blocks and hauling them up the bank on a sled she made from a truck hood. She set up the kick wheel in the shed with a lamp and a bucket of water, and she wedged and turned and shaped, and every evening she opened the notebook and read another page of her grandmother's 41 years. And slowly she began to understand that she wasn't just learning to make pots. She was learning a craft that was older than the town, older than the county, older than the country the county sat in. Because pottery is one of the oldest things human hands have ever done, older than the wheel, older than riding, and every hard thing about it had already been discovered and forgotten and discovered again 10,000 times by people whose names are all gone. And buried in her grandmother's book, underlined twice, was the one rule that all of them had learned the same terrible way, the rule that is 4,000 years old and one sentence long, the rule that Odessa was about to break and pay for. You cannot hurry water out of earth. That's it. That's the whole secret. Clay is full of water, water you cannot even see, water down in the grain of it. And when you put that clay into fire, the water wants to leave, and if you let it leave slow, gentle, coaxed out over hours like you're talking a frightened animal out from under a porch, the pot lives. But if you rush it, if you build the fire fast and hot because you are impatient and broke, and the frost is coming, that hidden water flashes to steam all at once, and it tears the pot apart from the inside, and it takes every other pot near it in the blast. 4,000 years of dead potters learned that, in the dark, one shattered kiln at a time. Odessa read the sentence. She even believed it. And she was still going to have to learn it the hard way, because there is a difference between knowing a thing and knowing it in your hands, and that difference was going to cost her nearly everything she had. Her first firings were small and forgiving. She dug a proper kiln now, a low brick chamber built into the yard bank the way the notebook diagrammed it, and the first few loads of little cups and bowls came out of it whole and rang like bells when she flicked them, gray going to a warm toasted brown in the fire, and she'd set each one on the windowsill and look at it a long time. It's not much, you might say. Some nights it was everything, but small and forgiving wasn't going to pay $1,400, and the frost was coming. And so Odessa got ambitious. She threw bigger pieces, wide bowls and tall jars, the kind that might actually sell. And she loaded the kiln fuller than she ever had. And she looked at the calendar, and she looked at the coffee tin with $12 in it, and she made the oldest mistake in the world. She hurried the fire. She told herself the clay was dry. It looked dry. It felt dry. But dry on the outside is not dry on the inside. And 4,000 years of dead men could have told her that, and one of them had, in a notebook not 3 feet from her elbow. She built the fire up fast to save wood and time, and about 2 hours in, standing in the cold yard with her breath smoking, she heard the first crack. It sounded like a rifle, then another, then a whole ragged string of them, pop, 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 deep in the belly of the kiln. The sound of her grandmother's clay and her own 2 weeks of work blowing itself to gravel in the dark. She didn't open it. She knew better than to open it hot. She just stood there in the cold and listened to a month of her life come apart. And when it finally went quiet, she sat down on the woodpile and put her head in her hands. And she said one word, one soft, ugly word she'd never once said out loud in her grandmother's house. And then she went inside. In the morning she opened the kiln and pulled out the pieces, and there wasn't a whole pot in the load, just shards and dust, and one warped survivor that cracked in her hands when she picked it up, and she carried all of it out to the edge of the field and started a pile. That was the pile the town would come to see. That was the pile Coy Tillman would nod at from his truck, and that was the pile Odessa Grimes would add to, load after load, all through that long autumn, because she did not quit. She wrote down what she'd done wrong. She wrote it right there under her grandmother's underlined sentence, in her own hand now, joining the book, 41 years, and 1 hard month. You cannot hurry water out of earth. She fired slower after that. She fired at night so she could watch the smoke and read the color of the flame through the peephole, orange to yellow to a pale hurting white, and she learned to bring the heat up over 8 hours, 10, 12, feeding the fire 1 split of wood at a time like her grandmother fed the wheel, and the losses got fewer. But fewer is not none, and money is not patient, and the frost was in the grass most mornings now, and the county courthouse in town had a clock on it that Odessa could not stop hearing. And it was right about then, when she was learning to slow down at the exact moment she could least afford to, that the men with the rules and the ropes started to arrive. The first was a man named Prewitt Gault, and he came with a clipboard. Galt worked for the county, some office up under the courthouse that dealt in liens and deeds and the slow machinery of taking things away from people legally. And he drove out to the low ground one cold morning in a county car and stood at the fence in a windbreaker looking at Odessa's kiln and her clay pit and her pile of broken pots with the expression of a man who has found exactly the mess he expected to find. He was not cruel either. That was the thing about all of them. He was polite, even soft-spoken, and everything he said was true, and that was what made him the most dangerous person who had come near her yet. More dangerous than Coy, more dangerous than Elton Rourke, because Prewitt Galt didn't need to break a single rule to take everything she had. He only needed to be slow. He informed her, reading off the clipboard, that her tax payment when she made it would need to be certified and processed and recorded, and that recording took time, county time, and that if the funds and the paperwork weren't all in order and stamped before the deadline on the county's books, the lien would mature and the ground would go to auction regardless of intent, regardless of effort, regardless of how sorry anybody felt. Rules are rules, he said. He almost smiled when he said it. That isn't a threat, he added, seeing her face. That's just what's true. And he got back in his county car and drove away. And Odessa understood that she now had to raise $1,400 and get it through a man who would be in no hurry to help her count. She had until the frost. She had a pile of broken pots and a shed full of half-good ones. And she had, coming up the road that very afternoon, the smoothest and most dangerous man of the three, though he arrived looking like the friendliest. His name was Sutton Greaves. He drove a clean gray car with an out-of-county plate, and he wore a jacket with no dust on it, and he had already heard, somehow, the way that kind always hears, about the strange gray clay in the drowned 40. Greaves was a buyer. He worked, he said, for a company that dealt in specialty minerals, clays and sands, and the kind of earth that goes into fine porcelain and industrial ceramics, and a dozen things Odessa had never thought about. And he'd had a sample of her ground tested, he said quietly, from a little dig he'd made at the road edge without asking, and he wanted to talk to her about her situation. He knew about the taxes. Of course he knew about the taxes. He sat on her porch step uninvited and laid it out gentle as a card trick. Your grandmother sat on something valuable out here, he said, and you don't have the money to hold it, and the county's going to take it before Christmas. I can make all of that go away this afternoon. He offered her a number to buy the mineral rights, just the rights. She could keep her little house, keep making her funny bowls, and he'd take the clay in the ground, the white seam 40 feet down, and never trouble her again. The number, he said, was more money than Odessa Grimes had ever seen in her life. It was also, though she didn't know the word for it yet, a low ball so far below the truth that Sutton Greaves had to work not to grin while he said it. And here is what he was really offering, under the number. The thing the profile of every man like him always comes down to. He was offering her a rope. Grab it, he said with his whole smooth face, and I'll pull you up out of this hole today. What he didn't say was that the rope was tied around her own neck, that once she signed away that seam, she'd be exactly what her grandmother had been for 41 years, a person who worked the ground for someone else's harvest, standing in a room she was told she'd never own. Odessa looked at the number. Then she looked out at the low ground going silver in the cold, her grandmother's ground, and she said the second real thing she'd said in this whole story. It's not for sale, she told him. Sutton Greaves stopped smiling for just a second, and in that second she saw the real man under the jacket, the one who did not like the word no from a broke girl on a leaning porch. Suit yourself, he said, standing, brushing off pants that had nothing on them. But you're going to lose it anyway, and when you do, my number won't be there. He got in his clean gray car. It's your money, he said. And that shrug, that same shrug Elton Rourke had given her, was going to come back around too. Then the sky opened. It had been a wet autumn, But the storm that came the third week of October was the kind old men name and remember. 3 days of rain that stood the whole bottom under 2 feet of water and turned Odessa's clay pit into a brown lake and floated the woodpile clean across the yard. She stood at the window and watched the low ground drown for real. Watched the water climb toward the shed where the kick wheel was. Watched the fire in the kiln she'd been 3 hours into building hiss and die under the rising wet. And something in her chest that had held all autumn finally started to give. In one night she lost the load in the kiln, the split wood she'd cut for a month of firings, and the whole dug face of her clay pit, buried now under mud and standing water. She couldn't work for weeks, and she did the arithmetic in the cold dark, and the arithmetic said she was not going to make it. She had $190 from odd jobs and a handful of good bowls not near enough sold to close the gap. 12 days to the county's deadline, no dry wood, no workable clay, and a man in a clean gray car whose number, even low-balled, would pay the taxes and the debt and buy her a warm winter besides. She sat on the floor of the leaning house with the phone in her hand and Sutton Greaves' card in the other, and she got as far as dialing the first 3 numbers. She got that close. 1 phone call from the end of it. And then, the way you reach for a hand in the dark, she set the phone down and reached instead for the coffee-stained notebook, and she opened it, not to any particular page, just for the feel of her grandmother's hand on the paper. And her eyes fell on a line low on a page near the middle, a line she'd read before, but never on a night like this one. "The world throws a thing out the minute it stops being pretty or useful," Verna had written. But that was never where the value lived, and a few lines down, in the same slanted hand, the sentence from the very first page, the one that had started all of it. "It isn't broken. It's just waiting on somebody patient enough to look at it twice." Odessa Grimes sat on that cold floor a long time. And then she did the thing that separates the people this story is about from everybody else. She decided the flood was not a verdict. She decided it was a lesson. Ruin is only a teacher you didn't invite, and she had been raised by a woman who never turned a teacher away. She got up. She tore Sutton Greaves' card in half and dropped it in the cold stove. And she went to work with what she had, which was almost nothing, which some nights is exactly enough. She couldn't dig new clay, but she had 2 blocks of aged clay in the shed her grandmother had wedged and wrapped and set by years ago, the good stuff, patient stuff, and she decided if she was going to make her last stand, she'd make it with those. She had no dry wood, so she went up the road in the rain, and she did the thing she hated worst in the world, worse than failing, worse than the flood. She asked for help, not for money. She never asked for money. She asked a man named Bud Ellery, who ran the little hardware and feed on the edge of town, if she could buy a truckload of kiln-dry lumber offcuts on credit against the pots she hadn't sold yet, and Bud Ellery, a blunt, gray-bearded man who'd known Verna 40 years and had never said 10 soft words to anybody, looked at this drowned, exhausted, stubborn girl, standing dripping in his doorway, and said, "Let me see one." "See one what?" she said. "One of your pots," he said. "Show me what you've been killing yourself over out there." So she went to the truck and brought back the one good bowl she'd carried with her that day, a wide, low bowl the warm brown of river water and sun, thrown thin, balanced, ringing when he thumped it with a thick finger, and Bud Ellery turned it over in his big hands under the store light for a long, long minute. And then this man who never praised anything set the bowl down careful as an egg and looked at her and said, "Well, I'll be. That ain't a hobby, girl. That's real. Take the wood. Take whatever you need. Pay me when you're able." It wasn't much. Some nights it was everything. Odessa fired those 2 blocks of her grandmother's aged clay, slower than she'd ever fired anything, 12 hours to bring it up, feeding Bud Ellery's dry offcuts 1 split at a time, all through a cold, clear night, while the flood water stood black and shining around the shed. And she watched the color climb through the peephole, orange to yellow to that pale hurting white, and she did not hurry the water out of the earth, not this time, not ever again. And at dawn she let it cool a full day before she dared to touch the door. When she opened it, everything inside was whole, every piece, a dozen bowls and jars and colors she hadn't even known that clay could give. Deep, warm browns shot through with flecks where the wood ash had kissed the surface and turned to a thin, natural glaze. And she stood in the cold morning holding one against her chest, and for the first time since her grandmother died, Odessa Grimes cried. Not from grief, from the other thing, the thing that has no good name, the feeling of a door you'd been told was locked swinging open under your hand. But whole pots don't pay taxes either, not unless somebody buys them. And here is where the story turns, because the person who bought the first one wasn't from Sweet Gum at all. Bud Ellery, it turned out, had set that first brown bowl on the counter of his store, not for sale, just to have it there. The way you'd set out something you were proud of, and a woman passing through the county on the state road had stopped for a soda and a road map and had seen it and picked it up and not been able to put it down. Her name was Simone Adair, and she was a chef, a serious one, from a restaurant 300 miles south that people drove whole days to eat at. And she was the kind of person whose entire life was spent looking twice at things other people walked past. She asked Bud where the bowl came from. Bud, who did not gush, said, "Girl out past town makes them out of the mud in her own field." And Simone Adair, holding that warm brown bowl in a gas station on a gray afternoon, felt the thing chefs feel maybe 3 times in a career, and she asked for directions to the field. She drove out the rutted red road in a rental car and found Odessa in the shed and did not waste words. "I need 40 of these," she said, "bowls, plates, the little cups, for my restaurant. I've never seen this color. What is it?" And Odessa, wiping her hands on her jeans, said, "It's my grandmother's ground." And Simone Adair, who had eaten off porcelain from Paris and Japan and did not impress easy, looked around that leaning shed and said, "Then your grandmother's ground is going to be famous." And she wrote a check on the tailgate of the truck, a deposit right there, more money than the pots and the taxes both, and she said she'd take everything Odessa could make and pay a fair price and tell every chef she knew. Odessa Grimes paid Prewitt Galt $1,400 in certified funds 9 days before the frost. She got there early. She stood at his window while he found 9 reasons to make it take longer, while he examined the certification and re-examined it and recorded it in his slow county hand. And she said not one word the whole time, just waited, because she'd been raised by a woman who could outwait weather, and when the stamp finally came down on the paper and the low ground was legally, wholly, undeniably hers, free of the lien, hers to keep, Prewitt Galt looked almost disappointed. "Well," he said, "congratulations." He did not mean it. It was enough. But you don't get to the vindication without going through the gate, and the gate had a name, and the name was Sutton Greaves. When word got around, as word does, that a fancy chef down south was buying Verna Grimes's grandbaby's pots and that more chefs were calling, and that the Drowned 40 had somehow become a place people drove to on purpose, Sutton Greaves came back, not to the porch this time. He went where men like him have real power. He went to the buyers and the galleries and the regional craft market that his company quietly had its fingers all through. The whole network a maker needs to reach the wider world, and he closed it. He put the word out, soft and smiling, that the girl was unreliable, that her supply was a fluke, that her ground would flood again, and she'd be gone by spring, and one by one the doors that should have opened for work, that good stayed shut. A juried craft fair rejected her without a reason. A city gallery that had called with interest suddenly stopped returning the phone. Greaves didn't need to lie loud. He just needed to be a big man saying small things in the right ears. And it worked, the way it usually works. And Odessa found that the better her pots got, the higher the wall in front of them grew. She could have argued. She could have driven to the city and pled her case and named the man doing it to her. She did none of that. She had never once in her life explained herself to people determined not to hear it, and she wasn't about to start. Instead, she did the only thing her grandmother's whole life had taught her to do. She went under the gate. If the galleries were closed, she'd sell off the tailgate. If the fair said no, she'd set up a plank table at the county market and sell to whoever stopped. She had Simone Adair, and Simone Adair told other chefs, and those chefs called direct, and Odessa filled every order slow and perfect and shipped it in straw and apple crates. And each bowl carried a little card in her own hand that said where the clay came from and one line from the notebook. And people who bought one wrote to say they'd bought it for the color and kept it for the words. She built her following the way she built everything, one at a time, in no hurry, feeding it, never forcing it, and it grew the way the clay seam itself had grown, grain by patient grain, under everybody's feet, where the big man couldn't see it. A year passed. Then the low ground did flood again, exactly like Greaves had promised, and exactly like her grandmother had known, and this time Odessa was ready for it, because she understood now what the town never had, that the flood was the whole reason the clay existed, that the water wasn't the curse on the land, it was the land's whole long, slow way of making itself worth something. She built her pit up where she could work it wet or dry. She let the bottom drown and feed. She stopped fighting the water and started thanking it. And the pots got better and better, and the orders outran her hands, and she took on a helper, and then 2 quiet local people the town had also written off. A boy who couldn't sit still in a classroom but could wedge clay all day, an older woman whose husband had left her with nothing, and Odessa paid them fair and taught them slow. And the leaning house got a new roof, and the shed became a real studio, and the pile of broken pots at the edge of the field stopped growing and started, quietly, to be famous in its own right, because people who came to buy would ask to see it, the monument to everything she'd gotten wrong on her way to getting it right. And then, 2 years and some months after he'd torn up her afternoon on that porch, Sutton Greaves called Odessa Grimes on the telephone and asked her, in the careful voice of a man not used to asking, if he might come out and have a meeting. Not to make an offer, he said, though he was lying about that, just to talk, just to see the operation. It seems I underestimated things, he said, and the sentence cost him something to say. Odessa said he could come Thursday. When he came slower, and he came without the smile that had nothing behind it, and he found a working studio and a yard full of drying racks and 3 people busy, and a woman he'd once thought he could buy for pocket money standing in the door of a thing she'd built out of the exact dirt he'd tried to take. And Odessa did something then that her grandmother would have recognized, something so simple it went right past him at first. She offered him coffee. She poured it into one of her own cups, a plain brown cup, warm in the hand, ringing when you set it down, the very same humble kind of gesture she'd have offered any stranger who walked up 2 years before when she had nothing, and she handed it to the man who'd tried to close every door in her life, and she watched him hold it, and she said nothing while he understood slowly what he was holding. Then Greaves made his real pitch, the one he'd driven out to make. His company, he said, had done its full survey now, quiet-like, and the white kaolin seam under her 40 acres was, he said the word carefully, exceptional, the finest domestic deposit they'd found in a generation, and they were prepared to make a serious offer, and he named the number, $40 million. He said it and let it sit in the studio air like a struck bell. $40 million for the mineral rights to strip and mine the seam, and Odessa Grimes could go anywhere on earth and never make another pot as long as she lived unless she cared to. Now remember the numbers, because this story keeps its accounts, and the accounting is its own kind of justice. $512. That was what the whole town said. The ground was worth the day she bought it, and they laughed. Some months later, Sutton Greaves had sat on her porch and lowballed her for the rights and thought he was being generous. And now, here he stood in her studio holding one of her own cups, saying $40 million. And the number was so far above the laughing that the laughing looked In hindsight, like exactly what it always was, the sound people make when they have not bothered to look twice. Odessa let it sit. She looked at the number the way she'd once looked at a flooded field. And then she gave him the answer that her whole life had been building toward, and she gave it flat, without heat, without a single glance backward at every insult she'd swallowed. To strip mine that seam, she said, they'd have to tear the field open, drain the bottom, kill the water. And the water's the ground. Without the flood, there's no clay. And without the clay, there's no work. And the work is the only thing here that's actually alive. Sell you the seam, she said, and you'd have $40 million of white dirt and a dead field, and I'd have money and no ground and nothing to leave anybody. She turned the plain brown cup in his hands with her eyes. It's not for sale, she said. It never was. And here is the thing, she added, quiet, the thesis of the whole story, the sentence I hope you carry out of this and into whatever field of your own the world told you to give up on. My grandmother worked this ground 41 years and never got to own an inch of it, she said. Now I own all of it, and there's men would give me $40 million to make it worth nothing again. She shook her head once. Give it time, she said. That's what she always told me. Time's the only thing turns mud into gold, and time already did. You're just standing in it. Sutton Greaves set the cup down careful, the way Bud Ellery had once set down that first bowl. And he did not argue, because there was nothing to argue. The work was the argument, and it had already won. And he drove his clean gray car back up the rutted red road for the last time. Now the story jumps, not by years, but by decades, because the last thing a story about patience should do is hurry its own ending. Sweet Gum is different now, though the road out to the low ground is still red and still ruts up in a hard rain. The leaning house is gone, and in its place stands a long, low building of local brick with big north windows, and over the door is a name burned into a cedar board, and the name is not Odessa's. It's Verna Grimes. She named the whole thing after her grandmother, the studio, and the little school inside it, because Verna spent a lifetime never being allowed to decide anything, and Odessa decided her name would be the first thing anybody saw. Odessa is an old woman now herself, slow-moving, gray, hands still rough as fence wire, and she still fires the big kiln by hand on cold, clear nights, still brings the heat up over 12 hours, feeding one split at a time, still will not hurry the water out of the earth, because some things you learn once and then keep for the rest of your life as a kind of prayer. The pots from Verna Grimes's ground sit in museums now, and on the tables of restaurants in cities Odessa has never bothered to visit, and in the plain kitchens of people down the road who saved up for one, and every single one of them, the $10,000 museum jar and the everyday brown cup alike, carries the same little card in the same hand. The clay came from a field they said was worthless, and under the words always, nothing's worthless. It's just waiting on somebody patient enough to look at it twice. She never sold the seam. It's still down there, 40 feet under a working field that floods every spring and feeds itself and will outlast every company that ever wanted to tear it open. And that, Odessa will tell you if you ask, is the whole point, that some fortunes are worth more left in the ground and worked slow than dug up fast and spent. Over the years, she did with her money the thing her grandmother would have done. She bought back other worthless ground, drowned corners, and written off acres. And she gave work to the people this county throws away, the slow ones and the quiet ones, and the ones who couldn't sit still in anybody's classroom. And she taught them the craft the same slow way she learned it, through their own honest failures. And there is a pile of their broken pots at the edge of the field too now, because she made sure to tell every one of them that the pile is not shame. The pile is school. And on the morning this story finally sets down, there is a boy in the studio, 12 or 13, a boy named Tavian who came up hard and got sent out to Miss Odessa's the way troublesome boys in Sweet Gum have been sent out to Miss Odessa's for 30 years. And he is standing at the wheel with his hands in the cold spinning clay, frustrated, on the edge of quitting, because his bowl keeps collapsing and the other kids laugh, and Odessa Grimes crosses the studio slow and stands behind him and puts her old rough hands over his young ones the way a dying woman once put hers over a frightened girl's. And she says, "Easy, you're forcing it. You can love a thing by leaving it alone." And the bowl steadies and rises, and the boy looks up at her like she's done magic, and she says, "No, that was you. I just slowed you down." And then Odessa Grimes reaches into the deep pocket of her apron and takes out a fat coffee-stained composition book with a rubber band around it. 41 years of a dead woman's knowing and 30 more of her own added in behind it. And she sets it in Tavian's hands and closes his fingers around it the way her grandmother closed hers. And she says, "This is everything I know, and everything I know is worth more than this whole town ever thought any of us were worth put together." And the boy, not understanding yet, the way she didn't understand yet, opens it to the first page and reads the one sentence written there in careful slanted hand. And outside the big north windows, the low ground lies silver and flooding in the last of the light, feeding, patient, worth a fortune and worth more than a fortune. And the sentence proves itself true one more time, the way it will keep proving itself true long after all of them are gone. Nothing's worthless. It's just waiting on somebody patient enough to look at it twice. And that right there is why I needed you to hear this one all the way to the end. Because I promised you at the start that this was a story for the ones who looked twice, and now you know why. The world will throw a thing out the minute it stops being pretty or useful, and it will do the same to people, and maybe it has already done it to you, told you that you were too slow or too quiet or too late, sold you your own life for $500 and laughed while you signed. But slow is not the same as worthless, and unfinished is not the same as broken, and I promise you, on everything Odessa's grandmother knew, that somewhere near you right now, maybe within a mile of where you're sitting, there is a thing the world wrote off and walked past, a piece of ground, a broken machine, a dying trade, a person, maybe the person in the mirror, sitting on a fortune nobody's been patient enough to see. So to these 4 things for me before you go, because I mean every one of them. Subscribe and stay, because there are more stories like this one, and the ones who look twice should find each other. Then leave me a comment and tell me the thing everybody told you to give up on that you kept anyway, or better, tell me the name of the one person in your life who saw what nobody else could, the grandmother, the teacher, the blunt old man behind a store counter, who said that's real. Take what you need, drop their name below. I read every single one, and I mean that. And last, share this with somebody who needs it today, somebody the world has been laughing at, somebody standing at their own flooded field with a phone in one hand and a card in the other, 3 numbers dialed, 1 call from the end of it. Send it to them. Tell them to look twice. Tell them what Verna Grimes told a scared, quiet girl with nothing but a notebook and a drowned 40 acres and every reason in the world to quit. It isn't broken. It's just waiting. Give it time. Time's the only thing that turns mud into gold, and it already turned yours. You're just standing in it.